So I want to kick off our summit with Matthew Lewis. Matt first came to our attention from his exceptionally good Twitter posts around cities, housing, development, climate, and transportation. He's a professional communicator for California YIMBY, plus a brand builder and a media strategist who is straightforward about his goals, stating in his profile, "I want to solve climate change, end the housing crisis, dismantle car culture, and ride bikes." I think we can all get behind his platform. So happy to have you here, and I'll turn it over to you, Matthew.
Okay, I should be unmuted now, and hopefully people can share my screen. Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? Yes? Can people hear me? Great, excellent. And hopefully you can also see my screen. So as Mary mentioned, my name's Matthew Lewis. I am Director of Communications for California YIMBY. California YIMBY focuses on solving the housing crisis in California. We're trying to make California an affordable place to live, work, and raise a family, and we do that by focusing on state housing policy and to address and correct the systemic inequities in California housing laws. There's a huge overlap with housing policy and transportation policy, and I would even say they're basically the same thing. And I'm going to get into some particular aspects of that today. And focus of my talk is how to beat the high cost of driving, which is a consequence to a large degree, as the last speaker mentioned, of our housing policies. So there's some overlap with, let's see, how do I move this forward? There's some overlap with climate policy as well, and California is a lesson to us all in what to be mindful of and looking for the future. And I'm going to get into some of that as well. But for starters, let's talk about what things cost. So in California, we're in the process of building a high-speed rail system, and the costs have been ballooning, and this has been all over the news. Oh my gosh, this train is so expensive. The cost grew $2 billion. It's now up to nearly $80 billion for a high-speed train that will take you from the Bay Area down to Los Angeles. Oh my gosh, $2 billion, that's so much money. How could we possibly be spending $2 billion on a train? At a more granular level, we hear this about things like bike lanes. There was a bike lane in Raleigh, North Carolina. The cost ballooned by $4 million. Oh my gosh, $4 million for a bike lane. That's outrageous, isn't it? That's so much money. Well, but hold on a second. Where does the money come from for transportation, and how is it spent? How often do we compare what we spend on transportation across different modes? And that's something that I like to do, and so it's one of the reasons why I'm here today. Right here, just down the street from where they're building the terminal for this high-speed train is a very famous bridge. It's the Bay Bridge. It connects Oakland and the East Bay to San Francisco. Well, that project went a little over budget, 2,500% over budget to be exact, and that one bridge cost $6.5 billion. So we had one bridge that went $6.5 billion over budget and a train that went $2 billion over budget. The bridge was controversial too. Nobody missed the fact that it costs a lot, but that was one bridge. There was a tunnel in Seattle that also went a little over budget. That's also, by the way, the bridge on the Bay Bridge, it's only for cars. They built a bike lane, but it didn't go all the way across. You can only go to the island and then ride back to Oakland. You can't actually ride your bike from Oakland to San Francisco. That's a tragedy that cyclists all over the Bay Area are fighting to correct. Here's another one in Seattle, the tunnel project, the Seattle Viaduct, about $250 million over budget. And then I know we're not going to get into Boston. There's a Boston discussion later, but there were some very funny things done about how over budget the Big Dig was. And one story pointed out that the Eurotunnel, which actually brought trains from London to the European mainland, was cheaper than the Big Dig by quite a lot, even though that was also over budget. And I think that the point that you start to realize when you look at the cost of trains and bike lanes and transit systems is in comparison to what we spend on infrastructure that is exclusively for the use of cars, it's actually a pretty good deal. Caltrans, which is the California Transportation Agency that maintains all our highways and does most of the spending in the state around roads and bridges and that sort of thing, their annual budget is $20 billion. So when people say to me things like the HighSpeed Rail are very expensive, with a total cost of $80 billion for the whole system, I point out that that's just 4 years of spending that we put into pavement in the state of California. And that money is spread out over 30 years because we know we finance transportation projects over a very long time. So in the context of an annual highway budget, just for highways and streets of $20 billion, is $80 billion really that much money? Let's go a little deeper. Americans spend $1.4 billion every day on gasoline. That's every day of the year. So is $20 billion, is $80 billion for a train? That's 80 days, that's 60 days more or less of US gasoline expenses. Starting to sound like maybe these things aren't as expensive as we think they are. Now let's get to some real numbers. You know, you talk about $1 trillion here and $1 trillion there, eventually you're talking about real money. In the United States, people spend $1.4 trillion a year on cars. That's car sales, that's car parts, that's gasoline, that's all the retail activity around cars. $1.4 trillion per year. That's almost 25% of all US retail spending. Now, granted, there's businesses at the other end of that. There's a huge ecosystem of industry and jobs and all that stuff that goes along with the cars that people are spending the money on. But the point remains, there's a lot of money being spent on transportation. In fact, trillions of dollars being spent on transportation. And the money is there. It's just a question of how do we prioritize it? Well, in the United States, as we all know, we prioritize it for things that look like this. $200 billion per year, that's about how much American states and cities and the federal government contribute to our road infrastructure. Now, that's the problem with that number, in addition to it, you know, a lot of that going to new highways that make traffic worse and add more cars to the system, is it's actually not enough. One of the things that we've learned over the last many years is that funding for the state highways, which comes from fees on, you know, such as gas taxes and registration fees, is nowhere near sufficient to maintain the roads that we already have. And as you can see, this is some information from the Highway Trust Fund projections. The trust fund goes bankrupt or somewhere around this year and is now in perpetual deficit until we start to figure out a way to raise money for it. That gap between the yellow line and the blue line is the difference between revenues and outlays, which means we're in a steadily increasing deficit as far as the eye can see on our highway and road spending. If you add it all up, highway spending, the amount Americans spend on cars and retail, it's about $2 trillion per year. That to me sounds like a lot of money. I don't know about you guys, but I can't write a check for $1 trillion. But I do know that if I had $2 trillion per year for transit and for bike lanes, I think we could make a pretty fantastic transformation of how our transportation system works in this country. Also, there's some important caveats to that $2 trillion. It's actually not a comprehensive figure because there's a $3 trillion backlog in our existing road and bridge infrastructure. That's how much money we need to fix the roads we already have. And those are only the direct costs. It doesn't include the cost of traffic. INRIC's estimated that we lose about $300 billion a year in productivity to people sitting in traffic. And of course, there's some things that speakers will speak about later, 40,000 fatalities a year, 2 million injuries per year, and air pollution and climate impacts that we don't even know how to quantify fully. Air pollution is one of the leading killers in the United States, but the climate impacts that we're seeing are just ballooning and ballooning, and these liabilities are compounding with time. So where will all the money come from? Well, we know we have the money. We're spending the money, trillions of dollars per year for a system that we are all in agreement, I think, isn't really working for us anymore. So there's another piece of this. And I know there's one thing that I want to make sure we do talk about is that the impacts of the way these monies are spent are grossly inequitable. We have set up a system of transportation in the United States that makes it even more difficult for lower income workers to participate in the economy, and they're penalized worse because of the requirement to own a car. That is a huge expense. People don't realize, like, oh, well, you can buy, you know, if you need it, you can get a cheap car. A cheap car still costs you $5,000 to $10,000 every year to maintain. And if you're on a low income, if you're on a fixed income, That's not exactly the kind of money you have lying around. A lot of workers in the United States are one broken axle, one broken alternator from being unable to get to work. And that's a huge problem in our country. And it's something that, that I think we have an obligation to address as a part of an agenda that really is focused on making our cities more equitable. We've seen stories about what the car industry has been trying to do to keep people in cars, such as extending subprime loans to car buyers. There were a number of articles last fall before the coronavirus hit about the number of car loans that were completely underwater. This story was about, started with a guy who owes the car industry $45,000 for a $27,000 loan he took for a car. That is just insane. That is not a sustainable way to move yourself around in the United States in 2020. In fact, the amount of money that Americans are spending on cars is so high that if we actually, as a thought experiment, if we actually stop spending that money on cars, you would actually turn most Americans into millionaires. Now, this is slightly hyperbolic, but only slightly, because the lifetime expense of owning a car here is close to $500,000. If you put that money into, say, an index fund over the course of your life and rode transit and rode a bicycle, by the time you were 60, you would have $2 million in your bank account. That's a lot of money. So we know we've got the money. We also know we have to do something, and we got to do something soon. We've now learned in California that the vehicle electrification revolution we've heard about has not arrived on time, and we're now going to have to completely overhaul the transportation system in the state to get there. How are we going to get there? That's one question. That's why we're having these debates here about the cost of the train versus the cost of how much we spend on highways, because there isn't only but so much money to spend on all these systems, and we need to rethink how we're prioritizing that money if we're going to address these problems. One of the things that we've now concluded in California, we have the California Air Resources Board, which sort of guides us on this, is we're going to have to redirect billions of dollars in transportation and housing funding. And I think that housing piece is really key. Remember, I'm a YIMBY, I work with California YIMBY. So yes, of course, I'm focused on housing, but all of these things connect. We need to be prioritizing funds for infill housing, affordable housing in particular, subsidized housing for low-income workers, closer in to where the jobs are, closer to our cities, in our cities, near where schools are, near healthcare, near daycare, if we're going to solve these problems. And that includes the climate problem, which is the big sort of hanging fire over all of us that transportation is now increasingly important to solving. We know that it's getting worse because of how we're treating housing. So the housing crisis has been a direct cause of increasing pollution from transportation in California. In fact, transportation is now responsible for about half of the climate pollution in California. And in the United States, it's the single largest source of pollution is from driving around so much. So the proximate cause of this, again, is we're forcing people to move further and further away from where, to live further and further away from where they work. And we've got to bring them back. We've got to create more housing closer to where they work to solve that problem. The blunt conclusion, Californians have to drive less. That's a very difficult thing for a lot of Californians to hear, but if we're going to solve climate change, we're going to have to do that. And frankly, if we're going to make more equitable communities, that's also going to have to be true, because access to schools, access to amenities is a part of this transportation equation, and you cannot solve that unless you solve this problem of housing and transportation, which again are the same thing. The upshot is we've seen pollution rising again, and there's no love lost between me and the car industry, in spite of some friends who love cars. I love them as well. We have some differences around that particular topic. But the reality is the car industry is an SUV industry, and if you look at what the International Energy Agency has been saying, all these lines are the trend lines of SUV sales. So this is a global phenomenon. The car industry has decided SUVs are the future for it, at least for now. There is some electric vehicle future that is always a future. It doesn't seem to be a present. But all these increases in SUV sales portend pretty bad news for pollution over the medium to long term. The average car on Earth is about 13 years old. So a car sold in 2020 to get 20 miles per gallon is going to be on the road getting 20 miles per gallon in about 2032, 2033. That's a huge problem for our pollution objectives and climate objectives. Consumers also don't know about electric vehicles, and the large reason is that the car industry is not really promoting them. Even in California, which has the most aggressive, largest electric vehicle market in the United States, people aren't buying them. You can go to the car dealership; they're not really trying to sell them. It's just not happening yet. Now, I have high hopes, and I really do believe we need to electrify the fleet and make that transition. But we're going to have to force the car industry to do it. And so far, if you've noticed, the Trump administration, electrifying cars is not their priority. We're going to need a change in administration. We're going to need a change in priorities. But the reality is that until the car industry is forced to do this, they know how they're making money. They've been pretty transparent about it. They're focused on building and selling SUVs. They've been telling the auto industry's been telling us for years that they need the money, the revenues from SUVs to pay for the electric vehicle transition. I don't think that's a fair trade. At least they've been honest about it. But the reality is, we're going to have to look to other ways to solve these problems until the auto industry is ready to play along. So how do we do this? And this is where I think YIMBYs and transportation advocates and equity advocates and the folks focusing on all these really have a lot of overlap in what we're trying to achieve. And in particular, in the mechanisms we've got to address to solve the problems. You can barely read this. I really, really hope everybody will go check out the recent paper by Giulio Mattoli about the political economy of transportation infrastructure. Incredible reading for those of you who are into this, and I think everybody on this is into it. But, well, he puts it pretty straightforward. Historically, roads were used by a variety of transport modes, including walking, horse-drawn vehicles, trams, and bicycles. What happened? Well, we all know what happened. We gave all the land to cars. This is a map I drew a couple years ago that got some attention. That green space in the middle, that is the amount of pavement that is dedicated exclusively to cars in the city of San Francisco. It's about 250 million square feet, if I recall correctly. That's in San Francisco. That's the most expensive land in the United States. We're giving it to cars. And by give, I mean the drivers only pay 25% of the cost of owning and maintaining that land. The rest of San Franciscans, they subsidize that. So that's a huge cost that we're just sort of granting to folks. Oh, am I getting pinged here? I think I'm okay. All right. I'm going to keep going. I can't see the chat. I'm almost done here. So there's been some great mapping work that's shown how this plays out across the country. And here's a map that of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Milwaukee is 54% rights of way and pavement for cars and parking. And that phenomenon repeats across the United States. We've just basically taken our downtowns and some of our prime urban real estate, and we've said, you know what, that's just for drivers. Nobody else gets to use that. That's a choice. We can undo that choice. And in fact, I hope that we realize we're going to have to undo that choice if we're going to solve our affordable housing crisis, if we're going to make more equitable communities, if we're going to make more space for people who don't look like us and who don't earn the maximum amount of money that a lot of cities are offering now. If we're going to have them in our communities, the teachers, the restaurant workers, we are going to have to confront this problem of how we are allocating urban space. It is not ours. It does not belong to cars. It's supposed to be a more equitable system, or at least I dream of it being a more equitable system. And I think we can get there. One of the facts that, I sort of just always blows my mind, there's 250 million cars in the United States, 2 billion parking spots. What is up with that? Why do we need 10 parking spots per car? That's just a gross misallocation of land on the merits. And then when you get into the equity issues, it gets even worse. So what are we going to have to do? We're going to need to address land use policy. There's some other speakers here who I think are going to get into some of that. I know that's ITDP's specialty, is dealing with land use policy at the city level, and the other speakers are going to do that as well. But this is stuff we have to do. This is not optional. The land is a zero sum in our cities, and we've got to reallocate that land back to its original use, which is helping humans get around and helping humans live, not just putting cars on it and calling it a day. I'm going to end with some examples of how we've done this in California. This is a BRT system that's getting ready to open soonish in downtown San Francisco. Residents fought it. But we finally got it done. We need more people fighting to get it done. That's really the bottom line here, is we need to build this movement for transit in our cities. It's got to be bigger. We've got to be louder. We've basically just got to shout down the folks who don't want any change. I mean, that's a lot of what this comes down to, is it's a political fight. And a lot of the voices who've been preventing this from happening have been dominating the conversation. So I know some folks get upset about how loud folks can be in this conversation, but the reality is the reason things are the way they are is that the loud voices have been calling for stasis instead of making the changes we need. So I hope more voices come in who are loudly saying, yes, I want transportation equity. Yes, I want housing downtown and not just parking for the people who drive in from the suburbs or wherever. Bike lanes, also controversial. You'll recognize this is actually Market Street. There was a fight in Playa del Rey down in outside of Venice a couple years ago where people were just completely verklempt about a bike lane that was proposed. The bike lane won because the advocates showed up in force and said, no, we want to make our streets safer. We want to make it easier to bike around. The good news in this particular case for Market Street is it is now car-free. A 30-year battle finally completed in January. So now it's mostly for bikes and trams and buses, and it's actually a transportation corridor instead of a car sewer. And I'm going to end with some, just on a personal local note. So this is the North Berkeley BART station. It's about 2 miles north of where I'm sitting right now. You can see it is a giant parking lot. One of the things we did last year, 2 years ago, was we got a law passed in California that made it legal for BART to build mixed-use housing on these sites with as much affordable housing, low-income housing, as it can possibly do. So that's going to be between 30 and 50%, depending on how the funding works. That will transform this neighborhood into a walkable, bikeable neighborhood, as opposed to the 40-mile-per-hour corridor that's on the right there and a giant parking lot in the middle. This is something that we're going to work on everywhere. You know, we need to make this happen everywhere, is transform these parking lots into other uses. And I want to just go through, and I'm going to wrap up now, but there is history here, and it is not pretty. The history of how these places got to look like this is one of the ugliest chapters in American history. And that is the practice of racist redlining and of racially segregating our communities by plat. We actually drew on these maps, and these are the famous redlining maps. You can find them for all over California. Here's Los Angeles. This is Cincinnati. This is Chicago. You've got the Bronx and Harlem here and Brooklyn. And then here's East Bay, California, where I live. What the pattern of these maps is pretty transparent. We're going to put all the people who aren't white over there. We're going to put a highway dividing them off from the jobs and the opportunity and the economic opportunities and the hospitals and the schools. And we're going to put all the amenities on the other side here. And we're going to force people to drive between. We're not going to give them the option of riding bikes or taking buses and transit. That's really what we're trying to undo here, is we have got to undo this 100-year history of land use that prioritize the car in order to enable these sort of racially segregated neighborhoods. That's at the core of what a lot of YIMBYs are focused on, is correcting these historic inequities. It is hard. This is hard work. But I want to end finally with a piece of news that I think is hopeful. And bicycles are sold out. We got a situation in the United States where bicycles are sold out. This is not something anybody ever predicted. And so I just want to close by saying, you know, we think that some of these battles are intractable, that they're too hard to win. We'll never overcome them. Things are happening. Things that nobody thought could happen are actually happening. And that makes me very excited. And so I'm going to wrap up there, and I'll take any questions. I don't think I can hear you, Becky.
Becky, we can't hear you.
Oh, there you go. All right. Becky, we've got no audio.
Without audio, I think I am going to jump in. Hi. So we have a bunch of questions, Matthew. That was pretty amazing. And I don't know if we can put them all into one category because they're all over the place, and some are quite significantly different from one another.
Yeah.
Let's see.
I'm back. Can you hear me?
Oh, great. Hey.
Wonderful. All right. I have one really quick question, if that's okay, Mary. I think we've got time for that. Matthew, you mentioned that many people are one broken axle away from not being able to get to work. And we've got a question related to that many of these jobs are being purposefully located in greenfield developments in the suburbs. And you mentioned in your presentation about the importance of putting housing where the jobs are. And I guess my question to you is, what about putting jobs near where people live? Where does that fit in?
So this is the sort of chicken or egg of land use policy problem, is that businesses locate where they feel like they've got optimal conditions, and that can be a whole host of conditions that they're looking for. The land cost is going to be one, the cost of building a building if they're building one, or renting one if they're going to rent an existing space. Access to a labor pool is a key component of that consideration. I think that at the end of the day, the land use policy that the government sets can play a pretty outsized role in the decisions that businesses make about where they're located. And it's our responsibility, it's our civic responsibility to stand up and make sure that that process includes a consideration for, are the workers going to have to drive 3 hours to get there from somewhere else? And you're just, let me give you a really bad example of how this was done very poorly. The Apple headquarters in Cupertino. Okay, this is in the heart of Silicon Valley. They built a 10,000 spot parking lot around the Apple headquarters in Cupertino because they had decided before they ever built the building, we're going to have people driving from the Central Valley to work for Apple. Government planning, better rules around, hey, you can't do that. You should build housing there so that the employees can live closer. It could have helped address that, but these are not small problems. These are big land use battles, and there's huge constituencies and powerful constituencies all influencing those decisions. But that's not a caprice of nature. That is the result of government policy. And we all have an obligation, I think, to engage in that and make the built environment look the way we want to live.
That's great. We have some more questions in the Q&A, and I just would like to say thank you. And Matthew, we'd love to have you continue answering those. Some of the questions about your sources and the maps and the article you cited. So that would be wonderful. I'm going to turn it back over to you, Mary, at this time.